Hello, I'm John Hartnett, a sort of retired Episcopal priest, and this is the next in a series of reflections on lessons appointed for the Sunday of the year in the Episcopal edition of the Revised Common Lectionary. Today we're going to be looking at one of the two Old Testament lesson options for this coming Sunday, August the 11th. I'll be reading the story of Absalom and David from the second book of Samuel. The lectionary, in its characteristic fashion, significantly edits the story and leaves out a lot. I'm not going to read it all because it would be too long. I understand why they tried to cut it. So this will be from the second book of Samuel, chapter 15, verses 5 through 9, verse 15, and verses 31 through 33. When I get to the reflection, I will explain some of the material that's been left out. Here we go. King David ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders concerning Absalom. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. The men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the slaughter there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest claimed more victims that day than the sword. Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. His head caught fast in the oak, and he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. And 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said to David, "Good tidings for my lord the king, for the Lord has vindicated you this day, delivering you from the power of all who rose up against you." The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" The Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to do you harm be like that young man." The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." The word of the Lord. Well, some background. This is just the tip of the iceberg of the story. It really begins with a character we don't hear about at all in this tale, Ammon, who is David's oldest son, his firstborn. Ammon conspires to lure and later to rape his half-sister Tamar, who happens to be the sister of Absalom. They had the same mother and father. Absalom, so one of David's sons, is handsome, he's charming, and he's very smart. He's in fact David's son, his father's son, very much like his father. David, when he hears that Ammon had raped Tamar, is very angry, but he doesn't punish his oldest son because his oldest son is his favorite. Absalom, finding no justice in legal channels for what has happened, takes things into his own hands. He waits for 2 years, arranges for Ammon to be murdered by a group of his followers at a gathering of all things of all of the king's sons. They go off together for a special sort of party, and Absalom arranges for Ammon to be killed there. Absalom has learned a dangerous lesson. If the law, the king, does not give him what he wants, he can arrange to take it himself by violence. Absalom fills the gap created by David's failure to discipline David's eldest and beloved son. Well, after the murder, Absalom flees to his mother's country. He gets out of town because he knows that things are going to be bad for him if he stays in Jerusalem. David, over time, misses Absalom, his handsome and charming son, and Joab, David's commander, military commander, who also happens to be his nephew, everyone's related in this story, Joab negotiates and sort of arranges things so that Absalom can come back to Jerusalem. The terms are he's allowed back in the city, but he can't come to the court. Well, Absalom soon tires of being excluded from the court where everything happens. After all, he is the king's son. And so he sends for Joab, in effect says, you got me back to Jerusalem now, please, can you finish the job and get me back to court? Joab ignores Absalom. He doesn't answer his calls, in effect. And Absalom, after sending a number of messengers, becomes increasingly annoyed with Joab and decides to get Joab's attention by sending some of his followers out to set fire to one of Joab's fields about to be harvested with the barley crop. So it just burns the whole field down. Joab, now his attention having been obtained, asks, Absalom, what's going on? Absalom makes his pitch again, saying, look, I need you to finish the job, get me back into the court. And Joab, probably not wanting to get anything else destroyed of his, arranges and gets Absalom admitted back into the court. Absalom then, when he's fully back in favor, the first thing he does, he gets a chariot and 50 men to run before him wherever he goes around in his chariot. He makes a little entourage, a sort of a scene wherever he goes. And Jerusalem is not that big a city at this point. And for 4 years he does this, and he would characteristically go down to the gate where people would come into the city, especially if they had something to bring before the king. And he would say, well, what are you here for? And they say, well, I'm here to bring this matter. And Absalom says, oh, if only I were in charge, if I were the person who had the authority to deal with this, I would take care of you. Don't you worry about that. As it is, you may not get much help, but if only I were king, things would be different. And Absalom, who does this in a much more charming and subtle way, I suppose, and because he's handsome and because he's the king's son, he becomes the very popular figure in Jerusalem. And during this 4 years, he secretly begins to plot how he might actually become not just the idealized king, but the actual occupant of the throne, the king himself. So after 4 years of sort of building up his base, as it were, under the pretext of going to make a sacrifice, he goes to Hebron, another city, which had been the former capital before Jerusalem became the capital. It's where Absalom was born. And while he's there, he declares himself king. And the network he has left behind, sort of his sleeper agents, all rise up at the signal and have an instantaneous coup. They seize Jerusalem. David barely escapes with his life, but on his way out, David, remember, who is quite clever, leaves behind spies and agents to let him know what's going on and to do what they can to undermine what Absalom and his advisors are trying to do. Absalom then makes a public event of having sex with David's concubines, 10 of them, as it happens on the roof of the palace, that same place where David met Bathsheba, or saw Bathsheba in the story that began this whole sequence of events. So Absalom has intentionally humiliated David and made it clear that there's no going back because he's taken David's concubines in every sense of that word, and they are now his property. David's agents, who are secretly in Absalom's court, and Absalom, of course, doesn't know they're speaking for David, they delay Absalom's desire to pursue David. They give David enough time to get away, to find a new base, and to begin to organize himself. And then when Absalom is prepared to go out that, David has an army to meet him. An army which is commanded by Joab, remember the guy whose field was burned by Absalom, so he doesn't like him very much. He had sponsored him initially, but Absalom literally burned his bridges with Joab by burning his field up. Anyway, so Joab is one of the three commanders. Joab's brother, another nephew of David's, is there, and a third person. And together, this army of hardcore professionals who have been trained and mentored by David, they rout Absalom's enthusiastic but less organized and less professional troops. So during that defeat, you note the story just mentions, by the way, there were 20,000 casualties. Now, when the Bible gives a number like that, I think it's probably metaphorical rather than literal, but it's clear a lot of people died. So this is just not a private fight between a father and a son. The whole nation is brought up in this, and a lot of people died. And we'll get to more of that later on. Absalom flees the battlefield, and in the course of this is caught in an oak tree. It says he was ensnared by his hair. Earlier in the story, it says he was very proud of his hair. And so this is what snares him, and it says he's caught there, and then he is surrounded. Now, the story that the lectionary gives you tells you he was killed by 10 of Joab's followers. The actual story in the unexpurgated version says actually Joab found him first, and Joab says, "Give me 3 spears," and Joab thrusts 3 spears himself in his own hand into Absalom's heart. So by the time Joab's 10 armor bearers and sort of his personal guard come, my guess is Absalom's already dead. But everybody wanted Absalom dead on David's side, but no one wanted to be responsible for it because David had said, "Deal gently with my son," which is, a story we'll deal with some other time. But Joab and his guard kill Absalom. A messenger carries the news to David, and then you'd think David, who is, barely escaped with his own life and barely survived this coup, that instead of celebrating the victory, though, his response is immediately to go into mourning for his son. How is my son? And the messenger, in sort of Oriental style, says, "Oh, would that all your enemies be like this man," which makes it clear he's dead. And then David says this curious thing, "Oh, would that I had died instead of you." Well, the fact is David could have died. If David had not fought Absalom, Absalom probably would have arranged to have had him killed. So there's something a little disingenuous. I'm sure David had deep feelings about this, but David didn't have to fight his son. He could have surrendered to him, but he chose not to. David's mourning for Absalom is a little reminiscent of his mourning for Saul and Jonathan when they're killed by the Philistines at the end of the first book of Samuel. A very powerful image of David mourning Saul, with whom he had this incredibly complicated relationship, and Saul's son Jonathan, who had been his best friend. Both of them killed as well. Well, that's the full story, or at least the next expanded version of it. And what I make of this is David has brought chaos on himself, his family, and his country. One of the things David does over and over again is he flouts limits. There's a little bit of the ghost of Uriah the Hittite. Remember the man who was married to Bathsheba, whom David had killed so that his relationship with Bathsheba would not become a scandal? The ghost of Uriah the Hittite kind of comes back and haunts David's family for the rest of his life. There are elements, it's sort of reminiscent of Macbeth or Hamlet, where ghosts figure prominently. You can imagine this story with Uriah the Hittite's ghost kind of hovering in the background. The evil comes, however, in this story not from outside, not from some sort of magic force, but from David's own character and practice. His children were, in his eyes, they were there for himself. He failed to discipline them, especially Amnon, the one who raped his half-sister, and in the course of David not sort of coping with the evil done by his son, David set in motion the ensuing chaos and death, not just for his family, but for the whole nation. Now, I wonder, Amnon the rapist, I wonder, had he grown up knowing the story of his father and Bathsheba? Did he think that, there was the sort of what we do in public or what we acknowledge in public about sex, but, in private, what we can get away with is okay because that's what Dad did. I wonder if there is a bit of that going on in Ammon's own character development. And I wonder if Ammon's sexual misconduct is David reminded of himself in this? On some level is he thinking, well, boys will be boys. I did this when I was a young man, and although there's no record he actually raped anybody, but he lets Ammon get away with it. I wonder if David's sons are something like a mirror in which he sees himself as a young person and on some level doesn't like what he sees. sees an ugly side of himself which he had concealed from his own image. But when he sees Amon's behavior, or even Absalom's, sees a little bit of himself there. Amon uses cunning and deception, not just brute violence, to rape Tamar. He lures her to a place where no one knows where they are, and sends everyone else away, so it's just the two of them. And she resists, and he overcomes her. So it's quite calculated and quite evil. And then there's Absalom. Absalom, the handsome, ambitious, cunning, and very patient person. I wonder, what does aging and no longer handsome David see when he sees Absalom? Does he use Absalom as an unconscious avatar for himself, an alter ego, a kind of, walking and talking action figure? David doesn't discipline his sons, as we've seen, and what happens? They become monsters. They have his talents, his skills, but not any of his admittedly minor moral sense or theological orientation. David uses his abilities to overcome limits and to be spectacular. And in the process, he seems to have seen all limits as things to be overcome, things to be striven against, and not any, apparently, to be respected. Now, he does repent when Nathan gives him that horrible accusation, "You are the man," after he's told the story of how he, in fact, seduced and killed, first seduced Bathsheba and killed her husband. He does repent there, and that's to his credit, but he doesn't seem to get changing his behavior that much. David fails to internalize what God has commanded. In the Bathsheba affair, by my count, he breaks 4 of the 10 commandments. Adultery, coveting your neighbor's wife, murder, and if he'd had his own way, bearing false witness. And God doesn't have to send thunderbolts, plagues, or floods. David's own behavior sets a royal culture of violence, deception, and death from which he cannot himself escape. The curse on David's house, pronounced by Nathan after the death of Uriah, has indeed come to pass. We see in this story the result of human desire and ambition, unchecked by godly limits. We tend to think and talk about limits as bad. This story, and not just this one, suggests the opposite. The more we get what we want without reference to what is the will of God, the more we trend towards David's side of the story. And it's not that the will of God is something there to keep us from having a good time. The will of God is there to say, left to our own devices, we tend to mess up. So sometimes we need to say restrictions are good and healthy for us. Unchecked, the selfishness of human nature tends to view and then treat other people as objects, agents, or obstacles. Tamar was the object for Amon's sexual gratification. Joab was the agent to get Absalom back in David's good graces. And David was the obstacle keeping Absalom from having a truly unlimited life if he could have been king himself. David chose to ignore the sins of his sons. As a result, their sins blossomed and grew and took over those sons' identities. Amon becomes a rapist. Absalom, becomes one who seeks to bring down the government by rallying his supporters against the king. David might have kept his sons had he confronted the evil that they had done. David did not, and so he lost, by violence, those whom he most loved. What might we make of this story? It sounds remote in time and circumstances, but is it? Details may be different, but what about the principles, the meaning of this story, maybe the reason why it was saved in the first place? Violating or ignoring limits may be exhilarating at first, but the long-term consequences are very different. David and Bathsheba may have had an exciting affair, but the long train of consequences do not favorably compare to the initial thrill. Remembering that principle is a potential weapon against temptation. Not talking about sin is not a loving gift. It denies a person, a family, a church, a nation, the opportunity to name, confront, and address difficult, toxic truths about ourselves. The Episcopal Church, especially in Rite 2, seems to me to shy away from talking about sin, preferring instead to talk about celebration and goodness. The confession, it says in the rubrics of the 1979 prayer book, the confession may be omitted, and often it is. On Ash Wednesday, now it is common for clergy to offer something called Ashes to Go. And it's an encounter to passers-by in train stations or street corners who can get ashes on their head without the extensive exploration of sin contained in the liturgy to which that symbolic action properly and historically belongs. The lectionary follows a similar path. The story of Ammon's rape of his sister is not included in the schedule of readings anywhere for Sunday morning. I'm not sure those are healthy choices. We don't have to follow the path of David and his family. But if we choose the beginning of that path, denial and not wanting to upset people and not talking about things that are dark and ugly, pretending that we're better off or other people are, or if we just ignore it, it'll go away. I mean, the thing is, not talking about sin doesn't make it go away. It just makes it go underground and become more toxic and stronger. We don't have to follow the path of David and his family, but if we choose the beginning of that path, we may at some point find ourselves wondering how we got to its end. What if part of the motive for telling this story is to say, this is what happened to David, but it need not be what happens to you? From that perspective, the darkness of this story might indeed be light for us. And perhaps if we pay attention to that, we might become something like the children that David had always hoped he might have had. A story of the King of the Jews and the son of David could have an outcome very different from the tale of David and Absalom. As we read on in the stories, may we see how that might happen.